So I watched this video by Joshua Schmidt, and it touched on something that I've thought about in Yu-Gi-Oh! For a long time. Board making and board breaking. Abstractly, it's about observing the back and forth that's supposed to take place during a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! But something always bothered me about it, because going first in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been good for a long time, which seemed obvious to me. The player who gets to generate resources first should be winning. If there's no way to stop them, they'll simply have more stuff than you. And this is the point that finally made that click for me.
The nature of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Evolves a lot around one-card combos, resolving and creating a lot of card advantage. Essentially, you're not playing 5 cards versus 5 cards. If you resolve one of your cards, you are playing like 14 versus 5, right? You've got 10 to 15 cards going first, your opponent has 5 or 6. If you can trade 1 for 1, you win.
Hand traps are, in theory, supposed to help the player going second, allowing for interaction to be played before any resources have been generated. But the problem with that is modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks are very good at launching their entire game plan off of one card, and no deck is more emblematic of that than the shiny new KT. KT effectively has 3 normal summons in Rotary, JJ Cooltoon, and their normal summon, so they really don't care if you stop one thing, because they'll just go do the other things. There are certainly points of interaction like Ashing Trackmaker or JJ Cooltoon, which don't feel that bad, but it's not great. So then who is Ash really for? Well, as it turns out, Ash and other hand traps are really good for simplifying the game state after the first player has drawn their cards. This was actually already apparent with Malice, with its big end board, but it would also then have Ash and Droll in their hand. My deck of choice is Sky Striker, which in its modern iteration just pluses off of Engage and buries its opponent in advantage. I'm not sure if my tone about this has been clear, but it's kind of boring. It's just not that difficult to set up several points of interaction past what your opponent is capable of doing on their turn 2. 0 Ash, 2 to 3 Widow Anchors, Lemnis Gate, and the Lemnis Gate Graveyard effect, not including other staples like Maxi, haha Master Duel, and staples like Droll and Bell. This presents several permutations of interaction that win the game. But you might be saying, isn't there an execution barrier to this? To which, I kinda don't think there is. I've played Striker for a while, but honestly, just throwing my interaction at whatever the hell the opponent is doing is kind of the strat. Could I realistically play around KTS? Maybe. I'm still gonna throw in a gate at their normal summon, because if they don't have it, I just win, and if they do have it, I have 6 more points of interaction. The game becomes very calculated at that point, and it seems like the sentiment around KT is similar. Points of interaction are just cross-referenced against your opponent and their top deck, with KT probably winning. I try to run my starters into it anyways, but going second can often feel like a zero-agency game that was won by my opponent before I even drew for turn. Well, that was pretty glib, but there are certainly counter-arguments. Good ones actually, and the reason why I wanted to make this video. I want to focus on this idea of board making and board breaking, but what I actually wanted to talk about was something a little different. Theoretically, if your opponent can be up 8 interactions to your 6-card hand, how does player 2 ever win? In comes the board breakers. We all know what Raigeki does. Maybe you've dusted a few spell trap players before and been like, great, I win now. But functionally, I think it's important to acknowledge the reason why any board breaker works in any game. And it's actually the same reason that we've been talking about, and that's resources. If I can trade 1 card for your several cards, then I can try to claw past your 8 points of interaction. The game for the second player becomes, how do I get to resolve my board breaker instead of, well, all of my starters are going to get negated. Spell cards have a tendency of doing this, being 1 card in hand but representing multiple cards in hand almost inherently. This is because they're often harder to interact with, so getting the value out of them is not that hard. And since any deck could theoretically be doing this out of their sideboard, mostly with breakers, the potential outcomes of the match become a lot fuzzier. Sure, KT can look at my hand, but what are they gonna do about it? So yeah, powerful spell cards worth more than 1 resource are often a good way to shore up this card disparity, but this doesn't have that much skill expression behind it. Like, slamming a breaker on your opponent isn't much of a choice, and sequencing one is still, like, not that hard. It usually ends up being the case that the breaker was either so incredibly good that your opponent could never do anything about it, or it doesn't play very well into your opponent and you just kind of scoop your cards up because you didn't really do anything. But I would like to talk about a breaker that I think has a good amount of skill expression behind it, and is still played concurrently. I think it has a very interesting way of how it tackles the resource problem in this game, and I think we can extrapolate on it a little bit more in the next section. That card is Forbidden Droplet. So Droplet is simultaneously several monster negates, a monster effect or spell effect dodge, a prevent my opponent from chaining to me card, and a discard outlet. So this card's insane. The amount of dopamine I get from reminding my opponent they cannot activate KTS in response to my Droplet is one of the reasons I still play Yu-Gi-Oh! Back to resources. For every time one of the Droplet modes is active, the breaking player kind of goes +1. Engage didn't just draw me a starter, it also dodged a Dracotail Flame, rest in peace Dracotail, and negated their Gulamel. This is how most dodge style effects work. KTS also is very good at doing this kind of thing when that trade works. But the thing that I like about Droplet is that it presents a lot of decisions for the activating player on what modes they want to select. What things do I want to discard in consideration to prevent responses from my opponent? Can I take advantage of the dodge aspect of the card, or is hitting Remix and Draw Step just better? These are actual skill testing decisions with an opportunity cost. So all things considered, Yu-Gi-Oh! Can potentially be a game where there's little value trades, like 1.5 cards being traded for 1.5 interactions, and that can be kind of fun. But then there's negates for everything. And we kind of come full circle to the problem, which is that the going first player will usually have an excess of resources. So these 1-for-1 trades, counter traps, hard negates are really, really good at oversimplifying the game. It's just not very interesting. And it works. I think we can all agree KT works, right? So this got me thinking about how could we theoretically remake hand traps to support this idea of like a 1.5 card interaction. And the principle that I think keeps this idea alive is the transmutation of resources and combination of cards. Droplet on face is actually kind of a -1, but can become a +1 or more when used as a dodge or a breaker. That's because it kind of transmutes one resource, like a card that's already being activated on field, into half of another resource like a monster negate or dodging a targeted negate. And with that principle in mind, I wanted to target 2 hand traps for a redesign. The idea is that the hand traps in question would be banned and replaced with these cards. And I know that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a complicated game, I'm not suggesting that these would actually fix anything, but I hope that as a thought experiment it provides some insight into what I think would make a better and more interactive Yu-Gi-Oh! Because no, I don't think having more resources over my opponent and throwing ashes at their face is that interactive. Let's first take a look at Cash Blossom of Money Dollar Bills. Same conditions as Ash, same once per turn, but I want to add 2 things to it. The first thing to add is that the activating player will draw a card. Now before you freak out, give me a second. The second part of the card would say the player who got negated gets to choose one of the following effects. Your opponent shuffles a card at random from their hand into deck, you draw 1 card, or immediately after this effect resolves, perform a normal summon. The problem that this card is trying to address is twofold. 1, it's allowing for the card to trade more like a 1.5 by giving both players the ability to draw. It's like transmuting one resource into another resource, and then making players reevaluate their hands. And then the second thing is allowing the negated player some agency in how they wanted to proceed with the game. The game doesn't just stop at getting Ash Blossomed, it kind of propels into something else. So I'd like to present some cases for how I think this would turn out in gameplay. For the player going first, negating a Foolos doesn't need to heavily impact your combo draw. In other words, hopefully this non-engine doesn't break your hand as often. It's also still a meaningful choice on whether you want to activate it into Foolos, kind of how Ash is a meaningful choice of if you want to activate it against Foolos right now. I don't know if you knew that, but you can just like not play into Foolos and then keep up Ash. Notably, if you bring this interaction to your opponent's turn, the draw can look to get you another hand trap, or maybe give you a better start if you can manage to make it to turn 3. There are actually already cards that kind of function like this. With the Dracotail interaction pieces, a lot of them say draw a card, so it's sort of like interacting with your opponent, not necessarily going to get to play another turn, but if you do, then the payoff is really good. And remember, the important aspect of Ash is that if it gets used to negate a key search, then that is pretty good value. Making sure that your opponent doesn't have access to an important part of their combo is really what Ash is supposed to be doing, in my opinion. But the hope is that this version of the card doesn't stop the game from happening. even though this is sort of the desired state that a Yu-Gi-Oh player wants, is that their opponent to simply pass their turn back to them, it's not really fun, as we've hopefully made clear. Instead, it gives your opponent an opportunity in the driver's seat for how they want to continue navigating their turn, and hopefully that allows them to make a skill-based decision about what they want to do. I think it's entirely possible that they already have answers for their opponent's board, in which case discarding a card at random is fine for them. If they need extenders or breakers, they can opt to draw a card, but if they already have excess material in their hand that they're trying to get rid of, they can go for the normal summon. For the going second player who's trying to use it to stop a going first board, negating certain searches, like I said, can definitely change the texture of the game. Drawing a card also has the same implication for the going second player because it's non-committal, you'll still have 5 cards in your hand, doesn't inherently hamstring your crackback when you get to your turn. Overall, the name of the game with this card is that the optimal line gets interacted with because stopping that key search can be important. But both players can get an opportunity to reevaluate their resources with the card draw and the choice for their modes post-negation. Honestly, I would just be interested in seeing what kinds of games could occur with this card, but I'm also excited to see the comments that are like, this would completely ruin the game. Regardless, let me know what you think. The other bird to address in the room is Droll. How do we fix Droll? Honestly, what we do is we ban it. So I ran a few fixes by a friend of mine, and honestly, this card seems nigh unfixable. It provides a very important function in preventing infinite value draw decks to run rampant, but it also hoses anyone trying to play the game at all. And importantly, we talked about this resource disparity at the start of the video, and it becomes really, really hard to equalize that card disparity when the going first player can just droll you. Which honestly, I just think is ridiculous. It would also cause really awkward interactions with Cash Blossom, so this is what it came up with instead. Presenting Malchormy Drollwalos. Not actually trying to be a Molcharmy or even attempting to be one, just thought the name would be funny. This card would have the same trigger as Droll, but instead of completely shutting off your opponent from what they're doing, it would say this. Whenever a player would add a card to hand or set a card to their own field, they instead draw a card. I wanted to include the clause that mentioned setting a card because that's how a lot of modern decks get around Droll, but also weirdly unfair that they get to do that in my opinion. The purpose of this card is similar to Cash Blossom in that it attempts to give the interacted opponent some resources while preventing negative play patterns like excessive searching for perfect pieces or multi-draws which take over the game. The hope is that it gives the Drollwalos player a lot of interesting decisions as they have to reevaluate their resources and what they can actually do with them. Think of it more like drafting the top card of your deck instead of just being able to search everything simulator. Now I know it's not saying much, but I'd much rather have a draw instead of no draws from Droll. Definitely a lot less confident in this card than Cash, but I also wish Konami would just kill Droll already because of how toxic its play pattern is. Notably, this doesn't interact as well against Fulos, or if you're a Master Duel head like me, Max C. I want to play around with a similar Molcharmy condition, like it checks how many cards are in the player's hand before it's active or something like that, but it seemed a little difficult. In order to make a more interactive game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, we have to acknowledge that both players playing the game is important. Whether that's building crazy boards and breaking crazy boards, or having some way to turn zero interact with your opponent, like a destruction effect, or setting trap cards and playing bigger monster cards. It's also important that those players are giving meaningful decisions with opportunity costs, so that players can come to their own conclusions on how they want to navigate the game. This allows for more skill expression and fuzzier gameplay to thrive. I know these redesigns are not perfect, but I hope they can communicate something that I want to see more in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think the idea of using a hand trap to stop one thing but transmute it into another, potentially less valuable thing, could allow for a lot of cool gameplay, but let me know what you think in the comment section below. And with that, I'm gonna go queue up against KT for the 70th time, and probably lose. See you later.